All right. Well, it looks like we're over the 20 participants mark, which is great. So thanks everybody for joining us over your lunch hour. I'm Juliana Lee from the Public Policy Center, and I am very happy to welcome Carrie Schuettpelz to present some of the work that she did over the summer. This summer, we had a little extra money in our coffers from our summer policy research program. So we supported Carrie's project. So Carrie is, I'm sure most of you know, a senior fellow of practice here at the Public Policy Center and also associate professor at the School of Planning and Public Affairs. And this summer she worked on a project with Acacia Roberts, who's a student at Iowa Law. So we are delighted to have them present what they've done so far on their project on Native American tribal membership. So thanks, take it away.
Yeah. And I'll also introduce Andrew Parr, who's here, who is my current research assistant through the School of Planning and Public Affairs. And he will say a few words a little bit later on what he's found as he's dug into this data too. So I do not have an hour's worth of talk in me. And so I'm hoping we can have a conversation and you might have questions and we can talk and have a discussion. I asked to do this Lunch and Learn in November because, as many of you may know, it is Native American Heritage Month. And so as many people are thinking about issues around Indian country and issues involving Native people and Native communities, I thought that this might be a good time to present some of this data. Oh, and Acacia is here too. That's great. So I've got my two research assistants here. I'm very excited that they're here joining me. And they will, well, you know what? Let's have them introduce themselves now, and then I'll ask them to say a few words a little bit later. So Andrew, do you want to just introduce yourself, say who you are and where you're from?
Sure. And I apologize if my internet connection goes out during this. But so I am a first year MPA student, Master of Public Affairs at the University of Iowa in the School of Planning and Public Affairs. So this is my first semester as well. So I'm kind of just getting used to the program. I graduated from the Tippie College of Business here as an accounting major. So I'm kind of switching gears a little bit. And then I also work on the side as a swim coach for the iFly Swim Club.
Nice. And that accounting background is proving very useful in our Excel database creation. Acacia, do you want to introduce yourself?
Yeah, so my name is Acacia Roberts. I am a 2L at University of Iowa College of Law. I graduated from University of Iowa with a degree in linguistics, French translation, and then I minored in Arabic as well. And yeah, I think that's about it. Oh, I'm Wyandotte. I should mention that.
That's and the vice president of the Native.
Oh, president of Native American Law Student Association here at Iowa Law.
Awesome. So I'm going to share my screen. I have some slides to show to you that I hope will be illustrative and interesting. And then again, hopefully we can have a conversation. So let me make sure this works. Hopefully you can see this. I'm looking at Andrew. He's on my screen. Can you see this? Yes. Okay. So again, very excited to be here. Thank you to the Public Policy Center, not only for hosting this, but also for supporting the research, the preliminary research for my book, which is called The Indian Card. I'm currently working on the proposal for it. It is part memoir, part history, part interview, part data. So a lot of different things, but I'm excited to tell you more about it. So to start, I want to just present to you a few facts. And these facts really became the bedrock of why I was particularly interested in this subject. In addition to being an enrolled member of the Lumbee tribe of North Carolina myself, when I was in graduate school about 15 years ago, I took a class on social capital with Professor Robert Putnam at Harvard, and sort of dove into the issue of what it meant to be Indian, kind of what identity shapes that. And so these are some of the facts that sparked that interest and that have continued to spark my interest. So over the last 20 years, the number of people in the US who self-identify as Native has increased dramatically. To put a number to that statement, in 2000, in the US Census, 4.1 million people claimed Native American or Alaskan Native identity. Just 20 years later, in 2020, that number was 9.7 million. So over doubled. Certainly birth, death, a sudden parachuting of new humans onto the earth. Nothing could explain that. But rather this idea of self-identification seemed to, which sort of leads to this next fact, which is that the number of tribal members in this country is a little over 2 million. So if you look at those numbers in comparison, that really has formed the basis of this data set, this project, and indeed kind of the starting point for my book. The disparity in the numbers can be really traced back to this idea of enrollment. Now, the idea of enrollment might be new to some people, particularly people who are not as familiar with the Native community. Essentially, enrollment is the process by which Native people become formal members of a tribe. What's kind of interesting about enrollment is that it is a very uniquely Native concept. Natives in this country are by and large the only ethnicity that must prove their identity with a membership card. Some may say that it's because this is more about political identity and the fact that we are members of sovereign tribes. But I became much more interested in the idea of identity more broadly. And so in other words, what does it mean that Native people have this additional hurdle of enrollment and membership that they must clear in order to prove who they are? Just sort of as a visual, because perhaps you've never seen one, this would be an example of a Native enrollment card. So these are cards from 3 different tribes, sample cards. They, yes, look a lot like a driver's license, have sort of the pertinent information laminated, fit into a wallet. The challenge with studying this idea, though, and looking across national trends and tribes, is that every tribe does it completely differently. You can sort of see that even by just what these cards look like, right? They're completely different. And so that makes looking across data somewhat trickier. There was this TV show no one's ever seen. Besides me, it is on Netflix, called Longmire. And a quote from that show is, "The US government only quantifies 3 things by blood: dogs, horses, and Indians." Largely, that's true. So in addition to the idea of tribal membership that I just showed you before with those cards, there's also this additional hurdle that Native people must clear in order to prove their identity, which is called the Certificate of Degree of Indian Blood. And here's what that looks like. So this is a document that's processed by the Bureau of Indian Affairs. Again, it's sort of wallet-sized, and on it has the degree of Indian blood that the given person is entitled to claim. The CDIB is used for a number of purposes. Often when it comes time to quote unquote prove your Indianness. So job applications, applications to educational institutions, scholarship applications, that sort of thing. And so this just becomes another layer to this idea of proven identity and formalized membership. So given all of this, right, that fact pattern that we started with, the idea of identity and membership, the primary research question really became, how do Native tribes in the US decide who quote unquote belongs? This question really drove my own book project. It drove this research, and has become one of those questions that you almost have to unpack layer by layer, right? So when I set out to answer this question, or to at least explore this question in a data-driven way, one thing that I quickly realized was that there is not a lot of data, at least not nationally, right? A large data set or available to the public. And so that became a real challenge. And if you remember back to the slide with the tribal ID cards, where I sort of said every tribe does it differently, that really necessitates this idea of some sort of data set that would include everybody on the list. Probably the best source of data that sort of already existed was a book that came out in 2006 called Tribal Constitutionalism. It was written by an Australian scholar named Kirsty Gover. And it had a lot of great prose. The challenge with the book is that the data wasn't publicly available. And so the graphs and the charts and the numbers were all cumulative. What this book did give us, though, which became a really important resource, was sort of a full inventory of all of the tribes that have constitutions and where we could go to locate those constitutions. Andrew, I don't know if you want to say a few words about that, because you've sort of dug in to that particular resource.
Yeah, so I mean, it has even more tribes than we have in our database, because our database has all federally recognized tribes. But it's interesting because, I mean, you scroll through this giant appendix at the end of this book, and you're looking at all of these tribes and whether they have a constitution or not. And so many of them don't, just because so many of them don't have it publicly available, whether or not it's because they consider it proprietary or it's kind of like a limited, something that's limited to the public.
Yeah, so this data set and this resource really became very critical to our own sort of gathering of data. From a federal government standpoint, there really doesn't exist a lot of data sets rather. The Bureau of Indian Affairs maintains what they call a tribal leader directory, which is very small in terms of its data. It has the name of the tribe, the address of the tribe, and the title of the current leader. And so that was sort of became our starting point. But again, pretty limited. Lastly, the US Census is starting to become more robust on issues in Indian country, but still mostly just includes demographics. And so, hopefully you can kind of make out the chart down here. These would be people who self-identified as a particular tribe in 2000. But again, mainly what this data set has is cumulative demographic information, things like age, gender, et cetera. So the solution was to build our own data set. And so that's what we did. We used the BIA tribal directory as a starting place because it had an exhaustive list of all the federally recognized tribes in the country. What we first did was took out Alaskan tribes, because anyone who's done work in Alaska, myself included, can attest to the fact that these communities are distinct and unique, and they deserve their own considerations. It's beyond the scope of this project and my book, but certainly that would be another sort of interesting thing to look into. Acacia, do you want to say a few words on sort of what this process was like just to start out? We had a blank Excel sheet, and sort of where did you go from there?
Yeah, so like you said, I imported all of the information from the Bureau of Indian Affairs, and I went from there. So they it was a very rudimentary data set. It was very unimpressive for the federal government. And I essentially I had names and places to go off of. And from there, I located self run websites from the tribes. I populated the data as much as possible from sources that they provided on their websites. For example, constitutions with all of the amendments, the population as they stated it versus what was found in the census. There's, as you can see just from this link, there's a huge discrepancy between self-reporting Indians and enrolled members that are displayed by the tribe. And then I did spend quite a lot of time in the Constitution and the when I could find them, the enrollment applications themselves, just to find people that we could contact and ask questions. In the Constitution, they're largely the same. There are a few big sections. One of the biggest sections in most of the constitutions is this concept of lineage that you see here towards the little to the right of the middle there, where it is mentioned where they get their enrollment. What is the word? The requirements from. A lot of that does come from the lineage that can be traced back. And these, if you notice, that those also come from census data from as early as 1906 with the Dawes Act, and continuing on through the 1940s. And it sort of stops there. That's where the lineage would stop. So basically just trying to find anything that a tribe has published or made available themselves and importing that data here, and then also adding a little bit of the census data to compare.
And I think hopefully what folks can see in that lineage column that Acacia was talking about was really going back to this idea that every tribe does it differently. And so this is kind of the challenge, right? Is that you're looking across 358 federally recognized tribes in the lower 48 United States, and you have quite different requirements and data points. I'm going to quickly answer a question that was in the chat because I think it's important to note. When I say federally recognized tribe, that means that it's a tribe that receives support from the federal government in the way of grants, and also has the ability to have a sovereign government of its own. I myself come from a tribe that is not yet federally recognized. We are the largest tribe east of the Mississippi River, and the largest unrecognized tribe. There is a bill in the Senate. Let us all cross our fingers. But that really is the key difference, is that idea of being able to maintain a sovereign government of your own, and then receiving federal support. So this is still very much a work in progress. We're learning new things every day as we dive further and further down into the data. But I think that the amount of data we've collected so far is quite impressive, considering that we are looking at a data set of 358 quite distinct tribes. And again, talking only about the lower 48 states. So I thought it might be helpful to look at an example of all of this, because sometimes this stuff can feel a little bit, this is just sort of what we have decided to collect so far. We might add to this list as we go, but so far, starting with some of the basics: tribe name, obviously address, website. Acacia talked a little bit about that enrolled versus self-identified population. That is quite hard to find. So we're still working on that. The way that tribes determine enrollment, blood quantum, lineage, et cetera. We will talk more about that in a moment. The link to their constitution, if they have one, and any notes that feel relevant on that. Land type and area. Anyone who has been to Meskwaki or near Tama can attest that the Meskwaki tribe has a settlement versus a reservation. So we felt that that was an important distinction. Casino or multiple casinos and names. And then one that we're still not quite ready to undertake, because it's quite an undertaking, is whether the tribe has a per capita, regular occurring per capita payment. So I want to look at an example, because sometimes this stuff can feel a little bit abstract and really complicated and hard to understand. So I wanted to take a tribe that most people would probably name if asked to name a native tribe in this country, which is Cherokee. And I want to just work through an example of all of this with that. So more Americans today claim descent from a Cherokee ancestor than any other Native American group. This probably doesn't surprise you. We've even seen people in popular culture sort of coming forth to claim Cherokee ancestry. In 2000, the federal census reported that just under 730,000 Americans self-identified as Cherokee. Just 10 years later, in 2010, that number increased by almost 100,000. So quite a large jump in self-identified numbers. In contrast, there are approximately 370,000 Cherokee Nation citizens. So I think that this tribe really embodies this phenomenon of self-identified versus enrolled members. That number, 370,000, is, less than half of all of the people who self-identify. I should also mention that Cherokee is the second largest tribe in the country. And so these dynamics are particularly at place, right? We can see them much more clearly. So in order to enroll in the Cherokee Nation, and this is straight out of their constitution that was last revised in 1999, all citizens of the Cherokee Nation must be original enrollees or descendants of original enrollees listed on the Dawes Rolls. I'll go out on a limb and say there probably are no original enrollees left. So we're talking about descendants of people who were originally listed on the Dawes Rolls. Now, what are the Dawes Rolls? Here's where we have to have a little bit of a historical interlude. And I am not a historian, but I can tell you that through the research that I've done for this data collection and also my book, the Dawes Rolls were part of a larger US federal government effort called the Dawes Act. It was enacted in 1887, and it essentially broke up reservations into allotted parcels for individual Native people. And so the federal government was trying to dissolve the power of Native tribes, Native communities, trying to Europeanize, for lack of a better word, Native people, and so split up their land and allotted that land to individuals. The Dawes Act is largely considered to be one of the biggest failures of US policy in Indian country, and there have been many. But a notable remnant of this idea, and the thing that's probably most relevant for this discussion, is the idea of Native rolls. So here is just sort of a visual aid in case I have not convinced you of how terrible this policy was. It's estimated that over 90 million acres of Native land were stolen using this policy of allotment. And this poster, was sort of an advertisement to non-Native people who were looking to buy land for cheap. And so when the government had quote unquote leftover land from giving Native allotments, they would then sell the land to non-Native people. Perhaps most interestingly for our conversation though on enrollment, what the Dawes Act required was this idea of rolls. So in order to award individual plots to Native people, first the government needed essentially an inventory of who was out there. And so the rolls were ostensibly created to determine who qualified for these land allotments. However, they were also a way for the government just simply to quantify how many Native people were left. And so, of course, as we know from history, the ultimate goal was assimilation, elimination of Native ways, elimination of Native communities and Native sovereignty, and sort of this idea of the Europeanization of Native people. One of the biggest successes, quote unquote, that the federal government viewed itself to have through this process was that they were able to divide up what is currently modern day Oklahoma, which was almost entirely Native country. And so the quote unquote 5 civilized tribes, which inhabited that land, including the Cherokee, who we've been talking about so far, they too were part of this act. And so when we go back to this idea of, in order to enroll in the Cherokee Nation, you must prove to us that you are a descendant of someone who was listed on the Dawes rolls, this is what we're talking about. We're talking about rolls that were created by the federal government to determine who was Indian, okay? What's interesting is, to this day, it's not just Cherokee, but many, many tribes, including all of the 5 civilized tribes, still use the Dawes rolls to determine enrollment. So what's that look like? So this is a Dawes rolls card. So this would have been a card that was used for people, for Native people, to identify themselves and attempt to get federal government approval as being Indian. You can see over on the left-hand column, you have your Dawes rolls number. This is particular for Cherokee, as you can see at the top. What you can see down in the lower right-hand corner is that this was circa July 17th, 1900. So right at the turn of the century. And, you know, a handwritten card that people were expected to fill out. What's really notable here, in addition to everything we've talked about, was that this really is the first instance of blood quantum being used as a formal concept for federal government purposes. Now, blood quantum is a very controversial topic, particularly in Indian country, but I can tell you that whatever you've heard about blood quantum, it is absolutely not a creation of Native people, okay? Blood quantum was invented as a way for the US federal government to measure how Indian people were. And this card and cards like it were the first instance of it formally being used. What is notable is that in a lot of instances, blood quantum was actually used against Native people, right? Whether it was to prevent them from attaining US citizenship, from keeping their land allotments. Sometimes their land was placed into extensive trusts. In some places, if your blood quantum was over 1/2 Indian, your land trust would be 25 years. And so this was often used against folks. So you can see when you came into the office, the federal government office that was set up near your home in Indian country, you were asked to list your name, your age, your sex, and your blood. Probably this threw a lot of people off because this was the first time we had ever seen this. And for Native people, probably the first time they had ever had to think about this idea. And so this has become quite an important relic. So going back to the Cherokee example, let's just continue to sort of look at this example. What you can see now up in the top right-hand corner is this is still called a Dawes application. And so if you were to go in today and try to enroll in the Cherokee Nation, you would first be given a form like this. This is actually the form. And you would be asked to complete it. Now, what you can see on here, I mean, it's sort of your standard bureaucratic form, but what becomes a real hurdle for people is that in addition to listing all of your relatives going back to the Dawes rolls, so in some cases 1900, as we saw here, you have to list their roll number and you have to provide copies of their birth certificate. For a lot of people, this has become a hurdle that they cannot clear. And so this kind of application is sort of it's a process point, but it's also become a reason that many people are not able to attain Native enrollment status. So again, just sort of listing all of the different data that you have to provide for every family member going back to the Dawes rolls. So let's return for a moment to this idea then of how we determine who belongs, how tribes determine who belongs. So going back to, if you can sort of visualize what that Excel spreadsheet looked like, and Acacia talked a little bit about lineage. We've now talked a little bit about blood quantum, but indeed all Native tribes use one of two systems to determine enrollment eligibility. So if you were someone who wanted to go in and apply for tribal enrollment, depending on what system your tribe used, you would either be asked to provide blood quantum or lineage, or in a lot of cases, both. Okay, so let's start with blood quantum. Blood quantum at its very basic level, and we've talked a little bit about this, is the amount of native blood that a person can claim. This is different, and I saw someone put something about this in the chat. This is different than a DNA test, okay? This is, generationally speaking, how much native blood does a person have? As a very simplistic example, here would be the blood quantum levels for each subsequent generation if you had a native person with 100% blood quantum who married a non-native person, and that trend continued. Here is sort of the trajectory of that. This is me. So just to put a finer point on it, my grandfather married a non-native person, so did my mother, so have I. And so my children are now 1/8 or 12.5% native. That is their blood quantum. What I like to point out, and this sort of gets to that DNA question. So this is my mother, 50% blood quantum. About 5 years ago, I had her do one of those DNA genealogy tests just out of complete curiosity. And according to her results, she is 60% a mixture of British, Scottish, and German, 20% from a handful of places in Eastern Europe, and 20% from the West African country of Cameroon. So blood quantum, right? This is not a scientific concept. Again, this was a construct. It was a cultural construct created by the federal government for a variety of things, including nefarious purposes, but continues to be in place today. In terms of our own data sets, we estimate that 176 of the 358 federally recognized tribes, again, in the lower 48, use some form of blood quantum to determine enrollment. That's about half, right? They don't all do it the same way. I think we're broken record on that by now. So tribes use blood quantum differently, depending on which tribe it is. The most popular ways, though, are 50% blood quantum, 25% blood quantum, and 1/16 blood quantum. So as you can see, the majority of tribes that use blood quantum are using a quarter. So they're using that 25% mark. If you can prove and demonstrate that you have a quarter blood from that tribe, you can then enroll. That has actually become another really fascinating element of all of this, is that some people have native blood from different tribes. And so that has prevented some folks from enrolling because none of their native blood from a particular tribe adds up to the necessary blood quantum. What's noteworthy here is that none of the federally recognized tribes use a 100% blood quantum requirement. It's estimated that about 80% of Native people live in urban areas, and as more Native people have children with non-Native people, or again, people from other tribes, 100% blood quantum is becoming quite rare. And so I think that tribes are realizing that the higher they make that requirement, the fewer and fewer people need it. In terms of some of the big players here, of the tribes that use blood quantum, the largest is certainly Navajo. Navajo is actually the largest tribe in the country now, having surpassed Cherokee recently. They have approximately 400,000 members. They use a quarter blood quantum. The Muskogee tribe, some people know it as Creek, has about 86,000 members. They too use a quarter. Minnesota Chippewa, which you may be familiar with, there are many bands up in Minnesota: Fond du Lac, Leech Lake, Red Lake, etc. They have a total of 41,000 members, again, a quarter. And then Tohono O'odham, with about 28,000 members, is one of the fewer tribes that actually uses a half, so 50% blood quantum. So let's talk a little bit about lineage. And lineage, again, Acacia mentioned it earlier in terms of trying to figure out what it's based on, and every tribe doing it differently. So what's kind of interesting here is that although those Dawes rolls that we looked at before used blood quantum as one of the data points, many of the tribes that use the Dawes rolls, including Cherokee, do not require blood quantum. So rather, they're using the Dawes rolls as a lineage-based system of membership. We estimate that 176 out of the 358 federally recognized tribes in the lower 48 lower 48 rather, use lineage to determine membership, which is about 75%. I actually think I have that number wrong. I think I may have used the blood quantum number, but we estimate that about 75% of tribes use lineage. Again, I'll make the note that some tribes use both. They use both of these systems. And as you saw from the Excel sheet, tribes use lineage in very different ways. Some of the most common, though, is many tribes are using the original Dawes rolls that we showed you from before. And so these would be circa 1890 to 1910. What's kind of interesting is that if you have an Ancestry.com membership, you can actually view the original Dawes rolls for many tribes. Tribes that are not using Dawes rolls are typically using their own tribal rolls. So they have conducted a census, a tribal census through their tribe as of a certain date. And that is what they're using as the foundation for enrollment. Another thing to note is that as we looked across the data, we noticed that almost every tribe that's using lineage is doing it from a long time ago. So pre-1940, a lot of the tribal rolls were conducted in the mid-1930s. Similarly, of the tribes that use lineage, the largest, so Cherokee, which we've already talked about, they're using the Dawes rolls. So around the turn of the century. Choctaw in Oklahoma has about 200,000 members. They use 2006 tribal rolls. That's pretty unique. That's very recent. The Ogallala Lakota Nation of 47,000, they're using 1935 tribal rolls. So again, that's sort of mid 1930s timeframe. And then the Chickasaw Nation, 37,000 members, are using tribal rolls from 1906. What does that look like? Well, here's the Ogallala Lakota tribal census, an example. So this would have been, and you know, it probably looks similar to the Dawes rolls, but this would have actually been a census conducted by the tribe itself. If you can kind of squint and look up in the top middle, you can see that this particular card was done in 1932. And similarly to the Dawes rolls, we have name, we have sex, we have age, tribe, and then we have a column for degree of blood. So interestingly, although the Oglala in their tribal census asked for blood quantum, they currently use a lineage-based system. So that's what we know. We, again, are still working on the data set, still trying to build it out and find more patterns and find more interesting things. But that's what we know so far. What would it be without a shameless plug? Tonight, I'll be reading from my book at Porchlight, which is the new literary center here in Iowa City over on East Washington, 7 p.m. It is in person, and you can register on their website. I will stop sharing. I would love to have a conversation. If folks have questions, now's a time to ask. So Steve says, it'd be interesting to add information on whether DNA is required since that is becoming more common. You know, I haven't heard of a lot of big tribes using DNA. Perhaps for the very reason, as I showed you with my mom's 23andMe results, but it would be interesting to better understand how they're using that. Steve, do you have any ideas on that? Steve might have stepped away.
Sorry, I was muted. Yeah, so I think it's more to establish paternity, but our local tribe has a blood requirement, and I was looking at another one of the Ojibways were using it as well. So I think it's to establish paternity for the most part, and particularly one of the things I guess as part of lineage where you have that, you have to have a paternal line for some of the tribes, and then you have matrilineal lines. So then that's also a kind of another sort of complication to the whole thing. So.
Yeah, so you're bringing up a really interesting point. And what we've found in looking across the data is that actually very, very few tribes use a patrilineal or matrilineal system. Meskwaki happens to be one of them. And so the Meskwaki tribe does require that your Meskwaki ancestry come on your father's side. It's still a blood quantum thing. It's not a DNA test that proves that. But I think as Steve's mentioning, perhaps used for paternity purposes.
Hey, Carrie, set a question from my time in the Indian Health Service on the Navajo, and then talking to people who worked with other tribal nations. There's a lot of differences, obviously, in a lot of things, but do you see anything where these kinds of differences cause policy challenges for the different tribal nations to work together?
To work together. I mean, I was prepared to answer just the first part of that, which when you said policy challenges, and I thought, yes, there are many. When you have tribes, particularly that have requirements that are keeping certain people out of enrollment, that implicates things like who can serve on tribal council, which of course becomes the sort of leadership body for the tribe. And so certainly there are policy implications. One thing I didn't mention, and I didn't mention it because I do still think it's somewhat rare, although we hear more about it in the news, is this idea of kicking people off the rolls. And so maybe you've heard podcasts about this, maybe you've read about it in the news, where you have tribes that for one reason or another have decided to kick people off of their roles, even if they fulfill the membership requirements. Now, some people think it's because they want to increase the share of per capita dollars that go to the remaining enrolled people. There are probably other theories around why that's happening. I will say it is still pretty rare in our research behind that, but certainly a policy implication, right? If you have people who you're disenrolling. In terms of working together, I mean, I'm not sure that I've heard of that necessarily happening. I mean, going back to this idea of, if a person has Native ancestry for multiple tribes, that can be a real challenge for people to become enrolled in any particular tribe, especially if their tribes have blood quantum rules that are high enough to clear and they don't clear them. So I've certainly met folks.
Yeah, I guess where it came to mind recently, I was talking to Kevin Washburn, as many of you know, is the dean of the law school, and he's a tribal member himself from Oklahoma and tribal law expert. But he was talking about in the new infrastructure bill, there's a lot of money that's going to flow through tribal lands. And, that if depending on the size of the tribes might determine how some of the distribution of funds go. And that's where I wasn't sure if there's any.
Oh, okay. Yes.
That in that.
So that's actually the Navajo example. So Navajo went from, 350,000 members to 400,000 members in what felt like the blink of an eye. It happened quite recently. And it's because, as we can imagine, a lot of folks on reservations are getting really hard hit with COVID in terms of job loss and things like that. And so they were doing this enrollment push as an effort to get more people funding, COVID funding through the federal government. They were still using their enrollment requirements, though. They did not change their enrollment requirements. They still have a 25% blood quantum rule. It's my understanding that they were trying to track down people who were descendants of people already on the rolls who had never registered or never enrolled. And so that has become a really interesting idea. And certainly Cherokee would probably have thoughts about that, having now been surpassed in size by the Navajo Nation. And yes, it does affect their slice of the pie in terms of federal funding. Federal funding for Native communities has never matched need, as it doesn't in a lot of policy areas. And so it's a very limited budget that goes to, as we've already talked about, over 300 tribes. And so with changes in that pie, certainly come changes in the share of funding that each tribe gets. Acacia, you had a hand up.
Yeah, before we move on from this, I just wanted to when you mentioned tribes working together, that just brought up something. I don't know if you were like interested in adding this, but one thing we also looked at was the idea of dual enrollment. In all but 3 tribes that I looked at, I don't know if it's changed since the data set moved on, but if you are enrolled in one tribe, that is grounds for dismissal according to most of the constitutions except for Osage, Lummi, and Karuk tribes. You generally, like, the idea of tribes working together, that's not something we really looked at, but the idea of not being allowed to be part of multiple tribes, I don't know, that brought up that point that I remembered we did spend a lot of time looking at that.
A question from Sam in the chat is, she's interested that tribes are relying on government created constructs. Why do we think that is? Well, I think there are probably a lot of reasons. One is, frankly, if you believe that you have some sort of data set that already exists, why go through the process of trying to create it again? And so I'm sure that had something to do with it. I will say that as it came time for tribes to create constitutions, and so this is why we see a lot of those lineage-based tribes using a roll from the mid-1930s, was that the US government had agreed to sort of giving the tribes back their reservation lands and their sovereignty, but they needed to have a constitution in place. That constitution often had to be approved by the federal government. And in order to gain that approval, tribes had to be measuring their enrollment in certain ways. And so I imagine that a lot of tribes used those Dawes rolls, used those government created rolls in order to get their constitutions passed. But that is why a lot of those tribes that you see are using lineage systems from 1935, is around the time when the push to create constitutions was coming about. Her second question is going back to federally recognized tribes versus not. Do you think enrollment requirements are different in unrecognized tribes because of the role of government? I mean, it's an interesting question. I think that, if you're not receiving any federal aid, there's really no carrot and no stick. Probably you can be more creative in how you're determining enrollment. We don't see a lot of that, though. I mean, frankly, as I mentioned before, we really just see 2 ways that tribes are doing it. I can tell you that in my own tribe, the Lumbee, which again is the largest tribe east of the Mississippi and the largest tribe that is not federally recognized, the way that we determine enrollment is if on a particular census, so it was from 1900, if on the 1900 US federal census, your ancestors lived in one of the listed counties and they were coded as Indian on the race category, you can enroll in the tribe. The idea being, the assumption is that they would have been Lumbee. And so, yeah, I mean, it's a very different way of determining lineage. But I'm not sure that we would see that same sort of pattern across tribes that are not federally recognized. It would be interesting to look at. It has not been part of the data set so far. Does that mean self-identified people won't be counted for a tribe's federal funding purposes? That is right. So when the federal government determines the size of tribes for its funding calculations, it is using the size of enrolled members. It's not using self-identification as that quantity. Steve.
Yeah, I'm a Shawnee tribe member. We actually had a big lawsuit over the CARES funding because we have a certain level of enrolled population, but they essentially counted our population as zero because we don't have our own independent territory. So sometimes they do even more complicated things. So
I think that what's been really interesting to dive into as far as the data is, again, just how different every tribe does things. And I think that that does impact the way that tribes are treated by the federal government, particularly if every tribe is doing something completely different and the federal government has to, for example, push out millions of dollars through a particular program or policy. It probably becomes challenging to determine how much goes to each tribe if they're all basing numbers off of a different approach. I think that it does go back to the idea of sovereignty. And so this is something that becomes really important to talk about when we talk about issues of Indian country, is that tribes are sovereign entities. And so they get to determine their membership and their enrollment and all of these other things the way they want to, because they do have that sovereignty. Yeah, Dane.
Hi, yeah, I'm Sagchip, and I know that we were one of the tribes that recently changed our constitution with the blood quantum requirements and all that. But have you noticed a trend with maybe tribes? I know you kind of touched on it earlier, but maybe increasing or decreasing those tribal requirements to join the tribes?
I haven't seen changes in numbers, but what I have seen is that they're using more recent roles to base the numbers off of. Potentially then that does change the numbers. But as one example, up in Minnesota, so we talked a little bit about the Chippewa tribe, which again has multiple bands. But up in Minnesota, what we've seen is a push to restart their tribal roles. And so anyone that is currently alive and enrolled in the tribe would be restarted at 100% blood quantum. And that would then, mean that for future generations, their blood quantum would be higher. Now that's confusing to me because I think that probably it will be a confusing venture to do that. But it's an interesting approach if what you're seeing as a tribe is a decrease in numbers, right? And if you're seeing fewer and fewer people reaching that bar of enrollment, and what you want is more people enrolled, then I do think we're going to see more tribes coming up with different ways of measuring. I have not seen anything that's wildly different from the lineage of the blood quantum systems. I would love to see that, but I have not yet seen anything like that.
Yeah, I'm curious if they reset everyone to 100%, how does that affect some of the federal programs that have blood quantum requirements, or like the state of Michigan's, has free tuition for people that have a quarter blood quantum. If they reset it, I'm just curious how that would work. I think it's a good idea, but I since we use lineal, I kind of think that's better because then we don't exclude our grandchildren. So.
Yeah, I mean, I think that the idea of blood quantum is becoming more and more ripe with controversy, frankly. And you're seeing a lot more tribes rethinking that system. It's not that lineage is the best choice. I mean, as I think we saw in looking at the historical side of things, we can probably assume that those Dawes rolls weren't totally accurate for a variety of reasons, right? There are probably lots of people left off them, lots of people who got enrolled without any Native ancestry at all. And so probably there wasn't a whole lot of integrity in those original roles. And so I think what I would love to see is tribes sort of rethink in this 2021, 2022 era, are there better ways that we could more accurately reflect enrollment? Now, certainly of people who would argue that if you want to become enrolled in a tribe, you have to have a meaningful connection to that tribe, right? And so just because your name appears on a list, or just because your great-great-great-grandfather's name appeared on a list, does that mean that you should necessarily get tribal enrollment? I think that's another really interesting question. Is what does that mean, right? What does it mean that you have enrollment? Do you have that meaningful connection? Have you ever been to the community? Do you still maintain ties with the community?
Right, which is kind of related, Carrie, to like someone like your mom who does identify, but it may not pass a test. It's like the opposite. Like, what about the people who grew up in the culture, really identify, but can't make those connections? Should they be included?
Right. And that has become a real challenge for a lot of the communities too. Or for folks, for example, at Meskwaki, whose native Meskwaki ancestry may come from their mother and not their father. They are actually being prohibited from enrolling in the tribe as a result. And so I do think there's a lot of really interesting conversations to be had. One of the reasons I feel really strongly about this research is that when you talk to Native people, they're really interested in talking about this stuff. So to me, it's really felt like an issue that we as Native people, we in the Native community should be talking about. Acacia.
Yeah. So, as you mentioned, these, based on what we looked at in the data, it is overwhelmingly patrilineal requirements, and the reason for any DNA test is to determine paternity. But just in case anybody's curious, there are tribes that are matrilineal. One that I know off the top of my head is the Cayuga tribe out of New York. Everyone that's born from that mother is listed as Native rather than everyone that's born from the father. So that's just one interesting it's not usual at all. It's extremely rare, but I thought that was like very interesting tidbit, I thought.
Yeah.
We have 2 minutes left about. Does anybody have any other questions for the group? Well, thank you guys very much. This was absolutely fascinating. I really appreciate the presentation.
Yeah, thank you so much again to the Public Policy Center. Thank you for everyone who came. And we're excited to continue doing this work.
Thanks.
Bye, everybody.
Bye.